It is the 4th of the 5th, 2026. The time is 25 minutes to 9. It is the afternoon after the morning before, or something like that. Meaning, of course, that there are a multitude of F1-centric threads at which we need to... Well, I'm not going to go long today. This will be quick and succinct, I promise. But there are some bits and bobs that I want to get to, most notably of which McLaren Red Bull beef squashed. Well, they keep stealing all of Red Bull's people and talking about it. So, of course, Laura Mekies was going to talk about it and say Giampiero Lambiase had to leave. Apparently, though, olive branch settings. So, too, we'll talk about McLaren's magic, mystery, loss of pace. Why were they so quick in the sprint race and sprint qualifying? And then all of a sudden, it went away. Mark Hughes of Motorsport Magazine has written an article on it, and we will talk about it and react to it. In the first instance, however, I've got to bring this up. A tad controversial, this, Izzy, John, Morris, Itzako, Dustin. Driver of the day was officially Max Verstappen. I don't place too much stock in these driver of the day voting polls, but I think it's techie, isn't it? Max, of course, did make a mistake earlier on, and it was an unforced error, an uncharacteristic unforced error. But the drive that happened shortly thereafter, was it fraught on both sides by aggressive manoeuvres? Mention no names, Carlos Sainz Jr. and Alex Albon. You bet your bottom dollar it was, but Max was playing with a very tight stop loss. What, therefore, did he have to lose? I mean, you pick Max or you pick Kimi, do you know what I mean? Depending on your on the lens through which you ingest yourself some F1. Oh, and by the way, Max Verstappen did ultimately get himself a 5-second penalty. And what Max Verstappen naysayers / haters are saying is, why didn't they give him it during the race? And I hear that sometimes you've got to punish in real time. But lest we forget, Liam Parker, Chief Communication Officer of FOM, said that F1 is no longer a sport. It is content, and therein lies your explain. And again, if we're talking about Max Verstappen, some have said that where Max had himself a good car, if he were to get himself a good car, he wouldn't be complaining about the rules and regs. No longer would we hear Mario Kart and World Battery Championship from him or them. Well, according to Natchez, Max Verstappen said a couple of different things. What I said about the rules, quote, still stands. I don't notice much difference. In quali, we're still not going through full throttle, and that's even though the cars have improved. So what say them now, then? The Max Verstappen, they says. Listen, I don't think we're there yet, is my honest opinion. I think the rules have gotten better, but I think there is something about the Miami Grand Prix circuit that flatters to deceive. It is low battery as far as its demands on the current rule and reg spec of car. And I think when we get to the Canadian Grand Prix, if they do not change it, then it will become a discussion point. Of course, it was a gangbusters Grand Prix, and that also helps further the agenda of the likes of Stefano Domenicali and Liam Parker, because if it's an exciting Grand Prix, nobody's going to talk about it. We don't have time, and that's as big a recommend of the Miami Grand Prix as I think you can get. Oh, and by the way, there's been a lot of chatter about Christian Horner over the last 24 hours, most notably from Joe Saywood. All F1 journos, as far as their integrity, are created equal, but some are created more equal than others. Joe Saywood, not a bad one, especially when it comes to leaking and breaking news. Mohammed Ben Sulayem apparently has said that he talks to Christian Horner regularly. If he wants to come back, I think he wants to come back, and I think he's going to come back. It's impossible to erase Christian Horner's name from F1. He's always been successful, but success breeds enemies, as we all know. He's missed in this sport, and I miss him too. Scoundrels Inc. Birds of a fly flock together, or something like that. But I agree with Mohammed Ben Sulayem for once. I mean, he's had a half decent 48 hours, has Mohammed Ben Sulayem, as far as some of his hot takes. We will talk about V8 settings in a couple of minutes. I think Christian Horner is missed, and I think F1 as an entity and a sports franchise is better for having him in the sport. I mean, box to box, the producers of Drive to Survive didn't have any content without him. Yeah, I think that says all you need to know, eh? Will he come back, though? Well, Alpine is the conversation, but it sounds like Toto has already laid the smackdown on that, seeking to buy at the 24% that the celebrity conglomerate Otro Capital hold. So where next? Aston Martin might be the last remit, but we know already that Lawrence and Adrian do not want him. Joe Saywood writes that Liberty, who now own, by the way, MotoGP, quite fancy Christian Horner to become CEO of that. You'll recall Christian Horner a couple of weekends ago was spotted at a MotoGP event and people started speculating because of that. I think that if that's what Christian wants, if that's the equity that Christian demands as a requisite to taking a next role, then fair play to him. However, I would like to see him back in Formula One, scores to settle and all of that. Toto, the boy who cried wolf, but I digress. Oh, and by the way, did you see Mohammed bin Sulayem? I don't even know. In the first instance, let me get the praise out of the way. Mohammed bin Sulayem has said that by 2031, at the very latest, V8s with synthetic fuel in place. That's his take. Full stop, new paragraph. I don't hate it, chat. I don't hate it. I'm going to sound like an F1 fan that's moaning. Do you know what I mean? Grass is greener type concept. We've been working towards V8s and V10s, and now Mohammed bin Sulayem gives us the green light, and Cameron's about to moan. You know what I mean? Damned if you do, damned if you don't. But Joe Saywood makes a good point. If we have this conversation underneath the following aegis and context, if F1 wants to be the bastion of the automotive industry, then it needs to adapt the electric and hybridization. Not to say that this is the right time, because again, 25% of all new sales of cars are EVs. But at some point within the next 5 to 10 years, there needs to be a sort of MGUH or MGUK adaptation. My point, the prevailing sentiment, is that it's just too much too soon. The EVs have taken a back step. All of my mates are craving V8s and V10s and V6s, want proper petrol engines. So I don't know. I think Mohammed bin Sulayem potentially, and even that he's going to ram it down the necks of the PU manufacturers. I don't know whether that's the best idea. Can you spell authoritarianism and totalitarianism? To which point you saw Mohammed bin Sulayem's inappropriate behaviour. I mean, he's always been a tad inappropriate. You saw his pictures that he took with Max Mosley and Prince Andrew, formerly known as Prince Andrew, man who doesn't sweat, when he was celebrating the Bahrain anniversary on Instagram. I mean, if there were a man who were un-PC, he would look like Mohammed bin Sulayem in the dictionary. However, yesterday, it felt like it were new lows. Picture to your right shows Mohammed bin Sulayem, keen as always to be the Beyonce to the drivers, Kelly Rowland. Get out of your own way, Mohammed bin Sulayem. Let Kimi Antonelli have his record-breaking moment. Youngest ever, 3 poles, 3 victories converted shortly thereafter. Leave him alone. Let him have his moment. No, you needed to do like you did last year at the prize-giving ceremony, ruffling Lando Norris's hair to Kimi Antonelli. You picked up a bottle of water and thought that it was a good idea to overstep Kimi Antonelli's boundaries. Antonelli was visibly uncomfortable, didn't want to acknowledge you, walked away. And what's more, they panned, of course, as you would if you're a decent producer, they panned, of course, after putting those images on the big screen to Kimi Antonelli's mom and dad. Kimi Antonelli's mom looked mortified. What are you doing, Mohammed bin Sulayem? I understand you have to be there as the president of the FIA, but constantly interjecting in these very personal celebratory moments. What are you doing? This makes no sense. We want to be talking about Kimi Antonelli and how young he's 19 years. He could even drink on the podium. I'll show you the pictures shot. Like, why? Why would you interject in a moment so key, so pivotal and seminal in the career of the chap who could be the next one, by all accounts? I just don't know. I just don't understand this at this point. He does himself and the sport a disservice. Get out of your own way. And to that point about Kimi Antonelli, where's Wally settings? Can you see the difference between the bottle out of which Kimi Antonelli is drinking and those of Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris also on the podium? Suffice to say that he couldn't drink. Do you know what I mean? He's not even old enough to drink in America, which again, I mean, Tells you all you need to know about what Kimi Antonelli is doing, the level at which he's operating at this younger age. I will say this, however, I want to pump the brakes ever so slightly. I feel like everybody's anointing Kimi Antonelli as that guy, as the champion 2026 uncrowned. I don't think we're there yet. George Russell will have something to say, especially as we go into the Canadian Grand Prix in a couple of weeks' time, a track around which he's had a lot of success. And I think there will be a mean reversion exercise, but that's not to diminish what Kimi Antonelli did. In Marcuse's article, he writes that the gap between Kimi and George was consistent. You've heard me say for the longest time that I would be concerned when Lewis is anywhere between 0.2 and 0.3 adrift of Charles Leclerc consistently, because that means that that's a gap that's true and fair and representative. You won't believe that Kimi Antonelli in sprint qualifying, 0.4 was the delta that he dunked on King George Russell's head. In qualifying for the Grand Prix Popper, another 0.4 rounded. Consistency. Suffice to say that Kimi Antonelli had 4/10 in hand on average over his teammate, King George Russell. That is chaos. And then you start to see these stats and realise that King George might have himself a problem. Holiness at F1 Big Data says, since becoming teammates, George Russell and Antonelli are tied both pole positions and wins 3 each. Oh, the humanity. You imagine George watching this? And then you get to see this as well. There's something about the way they're building him. It feels a lot like 2021 and Max Verstappen. The F1 almost wants itself a new champion. It sees that there is advantage and value for shareholders and broadcasters and fans alike in having a new Italian champion. And I think these pictures underscore that sentiment. Oh, and by the way, if you were a betting degenerate, you don't believe me on all this Kimi Antonelli hype. Kimi Antonelli is now officially the favourite to win the F1 Drivers' Championship in 2026. If you run a simulation of the remaining Grand Prix this year, 18 of, they say that Kimi Antonelli will win the championship 41% of the time. 41%. As versus George Russell as a barometer, 28%. That, ladies and gentlemen, is chaos. There is this wave. It happens from time to time. Mention no names. 07 Lewis on Alonso. That there is an athlete that comes along and sprouts wings and flies infinitely a long time before people anticipated. Toto backed him right. He thought that Kimi Antonelli could be the next one, but not at the age of 19, surely. And it feels like he's expedited for his learning curve and he's doing something different. What say you, George? And he's put out a couple of different posts on Instagram, being the English gent that he is. Congratulations, Kimi. Well done, mate. You're doing bits. You're a fantastic driver. You've always been a fantastic driver. We saw that from him last year. But I'm not worried, says King George. When we get to Canada, you will see this mean reversion. However, there was a moment caught on camera. I really like this. Do you remember Alonso's moment when he jumped out the car 2012, very nearly defeating Sebastian Vettel, but trying to understand how Seb got it over the line in the end? Check this chap out in the middle. This is Seb greeting, I want to say, one of the Cadillac drivers, Checo, I think. And then in between time, you have yourself George Russell spying one Kimi Antonelli. Listen, we've already seen the beginnings of fissures. You saw George Russell coming out the pits. He said, no, not today, mate. Get back in your cage. This is me and my priority coming out the pits here. I think it's going to, as this develops, chat, we cannot be friends at Mercedes if indeed we want the same thing. And that thing is a championship of the drivers for variety. At some point, just like the McLaren bods last year, just like Senna and Prost in 88, 89 and 90, at some point, teammate 2016, Nico and Lewis also at McLaren. 2016, Nico and Lewis, of course, at Mercedes. At some point, these teammates, when they're fighting like this, it will get techie. Silent Hour says jealousy. It looks a little bit, maybe it's just context. Maybe George is just looking over, but the framing looks, this photo will be a huge foreshadowing. It's techie, the techie things that. Let me show you this as well. because again, I think this is a conversation that we're going to keep having. People keep telling me, oh, stop with the obsession about Max going to Mercedes. Why? And this is the relevant, but I don't make the news, I just break it. Why is Toto on the Miami Grand Prix weekend so keen to get in shot when there are a gazillion cameras around underneath the umbrella of one Maximilian Verstappen? Yeah, they're friends, and yeah, they're on the private yacht. But again, if you understand the psyche of George Russell and what he will be going through, the insubstantial pressure that's coming on his shoulders by dint of Kimi Antonelli's lead in the driver's standings and the swathe and furore around him, his popularity and his mainstream stardom, and then you as team principal and manager of George are going to go and do that. Chat problems, particularly for George Russell if he continues to be going into the summer break. Forget the season entire. Imagine a world where going into the summer break, George Russell is still behind Kimi Antonelli, and then he ultimately turns it around to win the championship. The summer break, if you're trying to keep your job, George, is all that matter. That's the timeline. Because why? Because that's when Max Verstappen has himself a performance clause that he can effect and institute for. If indeed he's outside of the top two in the driver's standings, he can leave Red Bull on a Bosman for free. Null and void settings. Telling you, Toto will be dreaming of having Max Verstappen in that car alongside Kimi Antonelli. That's dynasty settings. That's 88, 89 McLaren, Senna and Prost settings, era defining as far as Formula One and Mercedes, who see themselves, of course, as a business, not just an F1 team. You remember Toto sat opposite Lewis Hamilton a few years back, just before Lewis Hamilton signed his Ferrari contract, and they had a conversation about strategic objectives and their divergence. Lewis said, I'm 40 years old nearly, and I'm looking at short-term time horizons. Toto said, well, I'm a CEO, mate, and I'm a team principal, and I'm a part owner, 33%. So my time horizons always have to be long-term. He's talking 5 to 10 years here. And what would be more long-term in keeping with those timelines of those strategic objectives than getting Max Verstappen alongside one Kimi Antonelli, the latest, hottest thing on the grid? I'm telling you, watch this space. I'm gonna shut my mouth for now, but we will revisit going in to the summer break. Oh, and by the way, we've got to talk about Lando Norris, because I don't think the rules and regs conversation is going anywhere. It is quieter for now. It had been louder at the Chinese Grand Prix and the Japanese and post the Australian one, but there are still people talking about it. Carlos Sainz says, yeah, it's a little bit better, but still there are things that we need to work on. Toto Wolff, in stark contrast to Lando, said, well, it's a fantastic race. Anybody said that this wasn't exciting needs to go away and hide. Way to sing from the same hymn sheet as Stefano Domenicali. You know why I think they align so well, Toto and Stefano? Because Liberty Media fancy Toto as the next CEO of Liberty Media, if I recall correctly. Hence why the sentiment of Toto mirrors that of Stefano Domenicali so closely in his interview with the guys and girls over at the race. Lando Norris, however, truth serum settings, here's what he had to say. You still get penalised for going flat out early on the throttle. Oof, that's techie. Counterintuitive as far as F1's concerned. I don't think you can fix that. You just have to get rid of the battery. Hopefully, in a few years, that's the case. Q Mohammed Ben Salam, 2031, V8 synthetic fuels. I think it's a bit dusting. I'm telling you, this is a little bit techie. I think it will continue, and I think we'll be having this conversation when we get to the Canadian Grand Prix. Infinitely more battery hungry than was Miami. Going to be interesting. I enjoy this. Here's go on and let me tell you about this. There's a couple here are your hottest of topics. We've got to talk about McLaren in the first instance, the beef with Red Bull, and so too we've got to talk about McLaren's loss of pace. Here we are then. In the first instance, there was beef, proper beef, when Lauren Mekies said of Gianpiero Lambiase, we had to let him go over the course of the Miami Grand Prix weekend, I'll have you know, that we had to let him go because the opportunity at McLaren was far too good for him to turn down. He's going over there, quote, to be team principal. And this comes on the back of rumours that Andrea Stella is set to go over to the red team with a yellow badge and a black prancing horse atop. Zach Brown et al. Weren't too happy at that. Nothing had been announced internally to any of McLaren's employees, nor Andrea Stella. Of course, they will be fuming. Why did Lauren Mekies do that? And they later went and clarified with Lauren, didn't they? Said, Lauren, what are you doing? Is that a transposition error? Is that a translation issue? We know that English isn't your native language. And Lauren said, no, I meant what I said. Gianpiero Lambiase, as far as we're concerned, is going to McLaren to be team principal. Oh, the humanity. Now, why did Lauren Mekies say that? Motorsport magazine write that there's a couple different reasons, not least because McLaren released a press statement or a press release even, during which they boasted about how many Red Bull personnel they have stolen / poached. And by poached, we're talking, of course, Rob Marshall. We're talking Will Courtenay, and now we're talking Max Verstappen's race engineer. That is something about which they can boast. Lauren Mekies clearly didn't like that, and he's got a PR thing to manage himself. The fact that Red Bull are going through something of a transition phase. So Lauren Mekies, of course, is going to get on his high horse and say, well, what are you like, if the opportunity of team principal at McLaren is too good to turn down, it's nothing to do with our team and all of the people that we keep leaving. There is a serious amount of personnel churn over at Red Bull. Broaden it out ever so slightly. Let's talk about the non-McLaren leavers. Got to talk about Christian Horner. So too, you got to talk about Adrian Newey and the bloody the chief mechanic of Max Verstappen as well. Max Verstappen's personal trainer. Everybody's leaving. Hannah Schmidt potentially at some point in the not too distant future. Jonathan Wheatley too. All of the key personnel that Matt said that he would need to keep if in order to stay at Red Bull through to the end of his contract in 2028. Over the Miami Grand Prix weekend, there was a meeting of minds because McLaren weren't too happy that Red Bull were out there leaking their dirty laundry and making all and sundry over at McLaren feel a little bit unsteady. Pep Guardiola of F1, the one that they call Andrea Stella's not a bad team principal. If he leaves, then McLaren changes. It changes in substance materially, right? Why would you want to stay at McLaren if you idolise Andrea Stella, aka the Pep Guardiola of F1, and he is leaving? Feels like Lauren Mekies was clapping back, trying desperately to destabilise the papaya colour team. Oh, and by the way, speaking of the McLaren colour team, the papaya colour team, lots of Max mechanics too. Oh, everyone's leaving. Everybody, McLaren gangsters, dustiness, poaching all the key personnel. What's the latest on Alpine shares buying Toto? Toto will do it in September, I think. That's favourite. Nothing set in stone just yet. Hannah is not leaving. No, Hannah won't leave, but it was rumoured. I feel like it's been rumoured that everybody's leaving. I think it would be good for Red Bull if Max moves up. Hurricane. Hot take of the year, mate. I don't think so. Who will they get to replace him, mate? Carlos Sainz and Isaac Hadjar, potentially. Go on, let me tell you about this McLaren. Because you would have realised that Lando Norris looked like hot favourite, right? How could he lose this race after what he did in the sprint and the sprint qualifying? Looked dominant. Looks like McLaren have bought all the upgrades just like they did 2 years ago at Miami and now have themselves a market leading car. They looked quick. Lando looked dominant around the track that he's always been really, really good. So what happened then between the sprint and the Grand Prix proper and qualifying for it? Well, Mark Hughes has written an article. Do you remember Andrea Stella said, well, there's something gone on around deployment. Got to remember that these rules are quite mercurial and there is a sensitivity to outside elements and variable change. But I can't say too much, said team principal Andrea Stella. Deployment and circumstance. He talked about the weather, the wind. Houseway? What are you talking about, Andrea Stella? What's the wind got to do with it? I mean, the other teams are fighting the wind in exactly the same way, right? They're all trying to survive the conditions at the same time, trying to set hot laps at the same time. So what are you talking about? This makes no sense. Wow, Mark Hughes writes a brilliant article where he says the wind indeed could have made a difference, because battery deployment, again, the approaches of McLaren and Mercedes around the Miami Grand Prix circuit were very, very different. During the sprint race, two critical parts of the track, the turns 4 and 6, and the straights between turn 8 and 11, excuse me. So during for the sprint quali, Mark Hughes writes that McLaren boosted everything, used all of their power through turn 4 and 6. Then that was the right play, right? That's why they were so gangster. Then between sprint qualifying and sprint race, they tinkered as far as the algorithm and their battery deployment to use it all between turns 8 and 11. The problem being, Mercedes did the other way. They were turns 8 and 11 and decided to use most of their battery deployment between turns 4 and 6. The problem is, though, chat, there was a change in wind between the sprint quali and between qualifying for the race proper, which meant that the place where you needed all your battery deployment was where McLaren had been using it over the course of sprint quali and the sprint race, which was of course turns 4 and between turn 4 and turn 6, and that's where Mercedes were using it now. That's why all of a sudden Mercedes gapped McLaren to the tune of 4/10 over the course of the 2 sessions, and that's why Andrea Stella's talking about battery deployment and sensitivity to the circumstances. Let me read this out. I don't know if I've described that too well. The sequence of interconnected turns, the 150 to 165 mile per hour corners of turn 4, turn 6 was very much key to the whole energy equation around this track. This was where you could back off and charge your battery more fully, ready for the long flat out section between turns 8 and 11, or you could attack those corners and run out of battery earlier on the straight. There wasn't a definitive right answer in qualifying. McLaren tweaked its deployment map between the sprints and qualifying for the Grand Prix proper in an attempt to eke out a little more, sacrificing through turns 4 to turn 6 more than it had during the sprint qualifying, believing the longer deployment on the straight would bring the lap time down further. But the wind increased, which was a strong headwind into turns 4 and turn 6, and that made that the wrong move. The extra grip, there was so much lap time to be found from the extra grip into the headwind where that you were better off attacking those turns like Mercedes had already been doing, but was now doing even more. Okay, so they didn't even change tack. Look at that. Unbelievable. So suddenly Norris was qualifying 0.3 of a second slower than the day before. Techie than techie things. It is sensitivity and it is variables. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, McLaren should have stuck to their guns, deploying through turns 4 and turn 6, and then Lando Norris could have put it on pole and got the lights to flag victory that his non-substantial talents and performance at the Miami Grand Prix, some say, deserves. It gets techier than techie things as always. Tomorrow we'll talk about Lewis, because he's had some problems with the sim and correlation, hasn't he? Poor Lewis. I mean, when it rains for Sir Lewis Hamilton, it pours, doesn't it? Just a tad. But again, Father Time is undefeated, undisputed, pound for pound, has never lost a round. What are we doing here?